Niggles. One of the biggest blights on anyone who's motivated to train, and certainly for those of us as we get older and as we get busier in life, niggles can become more of an issue, especially if we're maybe not training, how can I put this diplomatically, if we're not training quite right, which can mean a lot of different things, and I'm going to dig into that in this video. So if you consistently have niggles, which mean you have to stop training, there's something wrong with what you're doing. I'm going to talk about how we can get around that. I know how frustrating injuries can be, because niggles, if left unattended or trained through, will turn into proper injuries, chronic pain. My worst, I've had a few acute injuries, which are like, so an acute or chronic injury, acute is like I fall over walking out the door and break my ankle. It's kind of hard to avoid. Well, it's not, but sometimes it's impossible. So the worst acute injury I've had was I separated my shoulder, and I did that playing rugby. Fell, landed on the shoulder, very common injury in like rugby and horse riding and cycling, where you fall on the shoulder. But there's not much I could do to avoid that. A chronic injury is something that slowly creeps up on you. So you feel a bit of elbow pain when you're doing pull-ups, but it goes, and the next time you train, it's not really there, but then a week later you do some bent over rows, oh, it's there, and it's a bit worse. But it kind of, when you're doing the set, you can kind of get away with it, and then each week it builds, and suddenly, like 3 months later, you can't do any pulling, and it's just not getting better. You rest it for 2 weeks, doesn't get better. So the more chronic something is, the further down that rabbit hole of chronic injury and chronic pain you go, the harder it is to fix it. The worst chronic injury I ever had through my own stupidity was patellar tendonitis. I think it was 2 years I was in pain for. I was doing a lot of CrossFit, early days, not much structure to my training, a lot of intensity, far too much. I was running a new gym, things were stressful, working a lot of hours, but still training twice a day, probably under fueling because I wanted to look leaner as well. Some classic problems. Anyway, started to get pain in my knee and it flared up, kept training through it, because the problem with tendonitis is that often when you're actually training, it feels okay. It's afterwards it comes, when the tendon cools down, that you get the issue. So that lasted for 2 years, and the only way I fixed it was I had to completely stop doing any knee flexion stuff, and slowly do some rehab, and it recovered, and but even now, like, that injury caused such problems in the tendon. I just have to be careful with knee flexion, and it can just flare up a little bit if I'm silly. Certainly I do a lot of running, and squatting and running for me, I have to be very careful with balancing that. So how can we work around these niggles? How can we stop getting these niggles? That's what we're going to talk about, stop getting the niggles. If you've got a niggle, you need to go and see a therapist, someone you trust, someone who's good quality, and it might take a little bit of searching, and you need to do what they say, and you need to come out of pain. If you keep pushing into pain in your training, you're aggravating the problem. And that might mean that you have to miss out on some stuff, but I guarantee that there's no way around that. You've got to do that. So that's almost a whole other video. How not to get the niggles. It's going to take work, and it's going to take patience, and it's going to take training and recovering in a way that you aren't doing now. Because if you keep getting niggles, like I said, there's something wrong with your schedule, and only you can fix that. So number one, I've got, and these aren't particularly in an order, but I think this is the most underrated recovery protocol: sleep. If you're not sleeping for 7 to 9 hours a night, you aren't recovering properly. And I think this is one of the most common issues in today's society, is that we don't value sleep enough. People don't put enough priority onto sleep. And sleep, Along with eating, it's the #1 recovery protocol that anyone who's training with any sort of frequency needs to address. And even if you're not training, sleep is huge for your function at work, for your long-term health. There's a reason that shift workers die earlier than those who don't work shifts, because their sleep's absolutely shot to bits. They're regularly going low on sleep. Their circadian rhythms are a mess. So get the sleep nailed. And I'll give you 3 very quick tips for that. I do have another video about sleep on here with these tips in a bit more depth. Come off your screens an hour before bed. Don't eat 2 to 3 hours before bed. Cut out the booze and get more daylight during the day. Get outside. Through the window doesn't count. That's going to help you sleep massively. The other would be don't have caffeine after midday. Boom, sleep fixed. 7 to 9 hours a night, that's what we're aiming for. Fueling. Fueling for the training you're doing is incredibly important. It's hard to train very hard and be in a calorie deficit for any length of time. It's hard to train hard and not get enough protein for any length of time. It's hard to train hard and not have enough carbohydrates after those intense sessions for any length of time if you want to make progress. Okay, so we're thinking about making sure that we're fueling for the work that we're doing. Now that's hard, that can be hard to quantify, but essentially if you're constantly starving, if you're feeling like you're low in energy in the workouts, if you are getting the sleep required, it's potentially a problem with what you're eating. The other thing with fueling is people focus on calories in, calories out, and they focus on a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit. Think about the micronutrients. Whole foods have got to be the cornerstone of any healthy human's diet. Processed foods, so anything where it's got more than 1 or 2 ingredients, or you don't understand what's on the ingredient package, on the ingredients label, we're just not designed, we're not evolved to eat them. So whole foods have got to be the answer to a lot of the nutrition questions that we're asking. And we've got to think about fueling the work that we're doing. Not just the training, but your job every single day, your family life. And I think a lot of people get this massively wrong, and I understand that it is a very complex subject, and it is more complex than just eat whole foods. But that is a great starting point. And if we skip that and go straight into calories in, calories out, or like some complex diet, we're missing the wood for the trees. And that low-hanging fruit is where most people don't want to put in the work. So if you want to put in the work, eat whole foods 99% of the time. Don't eat ultra-processed shitty foods. Just cut them out. Don't buy them. Don't buy that junk food, because then when you're craving a snack in the evening, you'll go and have some yogurt and fruit with some almond butter, that's my favorite. If you watch any of my videos about nutrition, that's my favorite example, rather than the cookies or the cake or the ice cream. Just sack it off. We've got to start like being a bit brutal with ourselves. Now, I'm not suggesting we live like a monk and never have any sweet treats, but we don't need them. And you will start, when you eat whole foods and start thinking about cooking them properly and preparing them properly, you'll start really enjoying them, and you won't really want shitty foods. Number 3, have easy days. So don't train every single day. Don't make every single session hard. That intensity and volume has got to fluctuate. So when volume's high, intensity will be lower. When intensity is high, volume will be lower. So if you're pushing max effort in your conditioning pieces, you're not going to do loads of work. It's impossible. You'll end up just in this grey zone where you're not really doing anything hard enough, but you're not really doing enough to actually build a base. So volume is about building the base, and intensity is about building that peak. But the peak can only be as high as the base is wide. So we've got to have phases of training if we want to make progress where we're doing higher volume, lower intensity. So your conditioning work has got to be steady state conversational work most of the time in that phase. Your strength work is going to be slightly higher reps, slightly more time under tension, slightly less load. And that's That's the volume phase, and the intensity is going to be, that's where we push some heavier reps. That's where we push some more intense conditioning pieces, and we go through those phases. Part of that is we have recovery days in all of this, where we're doing genuinely easy movement, whether that's doing some movement flow, whether that's doing some stretching, some foam rolling, whether it's going for a swim, whether it's going for a walk. And it can be built into every single day, but we have specific recovery days where we're focusing on actually recovering. And you might go to the gym just to do easy work. You might just do half an hour at home in the evening in front of the telly. So having easy days is important. 2 more. Structure is incredibly important in our training. So kind of what I talked about there in the volume and intensity, we've got to go through phases of training. We've also got to have seasons in our training. Personally, winter for me is a time to back off intensity in training, keep things ticking over, absolutely, work on weaknesses, but we're not like smashing the training. Summer is a time when we can push the boat out a little bit more, burn the candle at both ends a little bit more. Humans are evolved to be seasonal creatures, and you will find if you have the winter off, or certainly a bit easier, you'll be able to push and make so much more progress in the summer. And you'll find in the summer, if you do that in the summer, you'll be able to do things that you can't normally without getting sick or injured. So we're going to reduce those niggles through that as well. Protocols are incredibly important. So what I mean by this is, for busy, hard-working people, life happens. It might be that your kid was up all night teething. It might be that you had a deadline at work, or a job came in last minute and you were working late, and so you're knackered, all right? And this just goes back to sleep being the number one thing. If you're low on sleep, your training is not going to be as high a quality, but you need to have protocols in place. So if normally you sleep for 8 hours a night, so this is what I would do. If I sleep 8 hours a night normally, and it's consistent, and I feel good on that, and my training's going well, sweet, we've found a sweet spot there. If I have a poor night's sleep, my little boy is up all night crying, and I get 3 hours, I have a protocol that if I have less than 6 hours sleep, my training is reduced by 50 to 75%, or I don't train and I go for a walk. I do some sort of easy day type movement. And then for the rest of the week, I don't try and jam that training in. I cut it out, forget it, do it again next week, or do it next week. Rather than trying to catch up. Catching up doesn't work. You're just squeezing more work into a period of time where you were just about recovering from your training anyway. Protocols for a day of poor nutrition, for whatever reason. You forget to prepare your food and you go to work and you don't eat well. Get to your training session in the evening and you're sluggish. Have a protocol in place for that. So think about all of the different things that could go wrong in your journey, in your week, in your schedule, around training and health and what your goals are, and have protocols in place for the what ifs. So that when you do have a shit day of eating, you don't think, oh shit, do I go to the gym or not? You should have a protocol in place in your mind for what happens then. If we can start looking at these different aspects of our lives and of training, we're going to reduce the niggles and injuries that we have. The very final and most important thing is movement and training selection. What you're actually doing in the gym is going to have a huge impact on whether you're getting injured or not. And if all of those other points are in place, but you're still getting injuries and pain, you're doing things that you're not at a point you can do. And I'm talking mainly about mobility and stability. If you're doing pull-ups, but you can't get your arm past this point overhead, you need to have this sort of range, there's no wonder that your shoulder is constantly sore. You need to stop doing pull-ups until you have that range of motion, okay? One of the big mistakes people make is they spend 20 to 30 minutes warming up for a specific movement that they've been told they have to do. And there's a lot of dogma around this. You have to squat because, humans should be able to. You have to be able to do pull-ups because, what if you need to pull yourself over a wall when you're chasing some bad guy or someone's chasing you? A lot of that is bullshit pushed by the functional fitness crew. And I understand where they're going with it. And in some respects, it does make sense. We should be aiming for our highest form of function as humans. But if you can't do a pull-up, don't do them. do ring rows, do bent over rows, at the same time as working on your overhead mobility and stability. But don't do pull-ups if you can only get your arm this high. Don't do squats ass to grass if you can't squat below parallel without your back rounding off and being in a horrible position. You're probably going to hurt yourself. So picking our movements to fit with where we actually are as humans is really, really important. I hope this video has been helpful. If you're struggling with niggles consistently and things aren't going well in training, something you are doing isn't working, and you need to be a bit of an investigative sleuth to work out what it is and make those changes. And you'll find that niggles recede. I know because I've been there and done it myself. I've also helped clients do it. Clients who've come to me consistently with niggles, and we change these things, we move these things about in their training and their life outside of the gym, and lo and behold, they don't have niggles anymore. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, share it if you liked it.